The Philippines has a land inequality problem. Over a third of private agricultural lands are owned by a tiny proportion of its landlords. Throughout its existence, the Philippine government has repeatedly tried to deal with this problem. Yet every time, land reform has failed. Why can't they make this thing happen? I've done a few videos on this channel about land reform, how inequality reform in South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan paved the way for greater economic prosperity down the line. In this video, we're going to take an opposite turn. We're going to look at land reform's multi-decade failure in the Philippines. Before the Spanish arrived, the Philippines were sparsely populated. Records are few and far between, but our best understanding is that land was owned communally by local families. You can own the products of the land, like whatever you grew on it, but the land itself cannot be owned, and it kind of makes economic sense. On an island with few people, land is abundant. True value would lie with the labor working the land rather than the land itself. This changed when the Spanish colonials arrived. They would occupy the islands from 1565 to 1898, over 300 years. And as European-style colonizers tend to do, the Spanish drew up borders and divvied out the land to people whom it favored and needed to maintain power. This abrupt transition from communal ownership, land owned by families, to private ownership, land owned by individuals, begins the Philippines' long struggle between the unequal classes. In the late 18th century, the Spanish shifted the Philippines' economy towards cash crop agriculture, mostly tobacco, sugar, and abaca, a type of hemp. This only strengthened land's value and encouraged the landlords to acquire more of it. The Spanish colonial legacy would be a highly unequal system of tenant farmers, living on and working lands owned by a cluster of extremely wealthy landlords. Those landlords were dubbed the Principalia. The Principalia started off as administrative clerks and trusted servants to the Spaniards. The Spanish, never able to establish a powerful centralized government from so far away, delegated ruling authority to the clergy and the Principalia. Over time, the servants would themselves become powerful. Records from 1897 in the municipality of Oas and Albay showed that 116 landowners, representing 3.5% of the heads of households, owned 60% of all the land. 80% of households owned no land of any kind. The situation in other areas did not get as serious, but in general, 70% of Filipinos worked land they did not own. Farmers became tenants, paying the landlord for the right to cultivate the land. This situation was harshly received by the native Filipinos. During the 300 years of colonial rule, the islands experienced over 100 armed uprisings. The final one, the Philippine Revolution of 1896, would overthrow the Spanish, only to result in annexation by the United States in 1898. The United States inherited the Spanish system and sought to reform it to prevent rural unrest from flaring up again, and in classic American fashion, they messed it all up. For instance, the land of the friars. During the Spanish era, the clergy had accumulated massive tracts of land. In 1905, the Americans paid $7 million to purchase 200,000 hectares of land to redistribute the land to some 60,000 tenants. However, the Americans based the resale price on what they paid to the friars. To the surprise of no one except perhaps the Americans, ordinary Filipinos were too poor to buy the parcels. So the land of the friars ended up in the hands of the Principalia and large American corporations. Then in 1913, the United States passed the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Law. High school students taking AP U.S. History may recognize this law. Among other things, the law allowed any amount of duty-free sugar imports from the Philippines into the United States. This law supercharged the Philippine sugar industry. 47 new mills were established, and production rose 502% over 2 decades. But it also worsened the land inequality situation, with American corporate money incentivizing further land grabbing. This situation was untenable. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, political movements by the peasantry strengthened on the back of anti-colonialism and the government's unfulfilled promises. Communism beckoned, and yet the land ownership situation refused to change. In Taiwan and South Korea, the land ownership situations were similar to what was in the Philippines, yet those areas successfully completed land reform, paving the way to the export-driven industrialized economies that they are today. Why wasn't it happening in the Philippines? A significant reason why were the colonial administrators themselves. Being very distant from their colony, the Americans, like the Spanish, sought local partners to govern their lands. They turned to elections to help choose the members of these ruling classes, but the administration limited who had the vote as well as who the candidates were. Naturally, the people who got elected were the local land-owning elites. Since their wealth was derived from the land holdings, it is no surprise that none of the proposed land reform measures really worked out despite being such a high political priority. Furthermore, Americans never really got comfortable with outright land redistribution, a radical move. They were ideologically committed to preserving land rights, and unlike with South Korea and Taiwan, there was no credible communist Philippine country rival to spur otherwise. So most land reform measures focused on merely improving the land tenants' living situations rather than eliminating it altogether. These laws might have helped, except for all the loopholes mysteriously built into them. For instance, the Rice Tenancy Act of 1933, which set a ceiling on tenancy interest loans and made it illegal to dismiss a tenant for no reason. Seems reasonable, however, the law had a loophole built into it. In order to apply to a particular area, the local municipality's council members had to vote it into power, but most of the council members were themselves landowners, so, well, yeah, you get the point. In 1946, the Philippines gained their formal independence. The Americans had left, but the new rulers still looked an awful lot like the old ones. The old landed elites comfortably rose once again to positions of national power. After the first post-war election for the Philippine House of Representatives, over 60% of the 98 congressmen came from families who already held power from 1907 to 1941. This is in huge contrast to South Korea and Taiwan, whose landed elites closely collaborated with the Japanese occupiers. So, when the Japanese were evicted, so were they, leaving their properties to be seized by the new rulers. But in the Philippines, the regional politicians held and in some cases enhanced their power, in some cases becoming local warlords wielding their own private armies. The new Philippine government struggled to centralize power and maintain order, especially in the countryside. In part due to the poor conditions of the Philippine countryside, several substantial peasant uprisings occurred throughout the 1950s. The most significant of these uprisings was the Huk Rebellion, which began as a Japanese resistance army during the war. The rebellion fought the government for over a decade. Recognizing that completing land reform was key to winning the support of the people, the new Philippine governments prepared several proposals. But again and again, the landlord-dominated Congress watered down the laws. For instance, the Land Reform Act of 1955 originally called for the compulsory purchase of land estates exceeding 144 hectares. However, the limits were somehow changed again from 144 hectares for all lands to 300 hectares for individuals and 600 hectares for corporations. Furthermore, that 300 number only applied for single contiguous rice farms, not total holdings. Eligibility for individually owned non-rice farms was a stunning 1,024 hectares. With reforms like these, you can easily see how the landlords continued to hold onto their power throughout the 1950s and 60s. Without significant external pressures, the landed elites remained elite over the years, passing their powers and offices down through the generations. In 1965, President Ferdinand Marcos took office. Amidst extensive student demonstrations and rising outbreaks of revolutionary violence, Marcos declared martial law in 1972. He saw martial law as a necessary measure in his battle against the oligarchy elites and the creation of his new society. Promising to quickly address the land inequality situation, Marcos issued Presidential Decree 27 in 1972. It implemented a pair of programs attempting to convert tenant farmers to farmer owners. If a landlord's land holdings exceeded a certain size, the state would acquire that land at a value 2.5 times of a crop harvest. The tenant farmers would be able to own the land outright after 15 years. For the first time, Filipino tenant farmers were allowed to own the lands they farmed. It was a radical step forward. However, PD 27 suffered from two major loopholes. First, it only applied to lands for growing rice and corn. Landlords evaded the rule by switching their lands to growing other crops. And second, the law only applied to tenanted farmer workers, a specific situation. Landless farm workers did not benefit, so landlords simply evicted their tenants. Furthermore, the choice to pay the landlords in cash was a critical misstep. The banking system botched up the program, making the land acquisition process tedious and burdensome. Long backlogs encouraged landlords to take extra efforts to evade land appropriation. The reform policy's creator saw this issue coming and had fruitlessly argued for the Philippines to follow Taiwan's example of compensating the landlords with shares in publicly owned government corporations. This would have given the landlords participation in the country's industrialization. With these loopholes, PD 27 only applied to about 12 to 14% of the total cultivated lands in the Philippines. So again, the landed elites evaded the rule, and the government did not have the political will, even under martial law, to push forward. In fact, the law and its circumstances allowed many Marcos supporters to extend their power and expand their land holdings. The Marcos land reform program fell far short of its promised goals. As the economy deteriorated and corruption worsened, the People Power Revolution eventually overthrew the Marcos regime in 1986. By the late 1980s, the distribution of agricultural land ownership had become extremely uneven. Less than 2% of total landowners in the Philippines owned a third of the country's agricultural land. And 60% of the country's farmers did not have land of their own at all. This was a land ownership fiasco. The new president, Corazon Aquino, made land inequality her political slogan. During the campaign, she promised that she would pass a land-to-the-tiller program that would address her own family's 6,453-hectare sugar plantation, Hacienda Luisita. In 1988, her administration passed the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, or CARP. The Philippine government initially funded CARP with 50 billion pesos in 1988 to acquire and distribute land in 10 years. Additional funds would come out of the ill-gotten gains of the Marcos administration and his cronies. As originally set out, the program targeted 10.3 million hectares of agricultural land, worked by 4 million landless and tenanted farmers. This represented 80% of the population. However, CARP targets were watered down as it passed through Congress. The Senate was full of pro-reform city-based businessmen, while the landlords dominated the House. The two clashed over how the bill would work. Targeted landlords had the option to either sell their land directly to the tenants or through the government at a market price. Buyers could make their purchase with a 30-year government-backed loan. Amidst a bad economy, the Aquino government struggled to fund the program. Remember market price. And poor farmers not only have to own the land, they also have to get new technologies like tractors, fertilizers, educational programs, and seeds. Someone needs to pay for all that. CARP succeeded to a certain extent with the landlords who ultimately sold willingly. Unfortunately, allowing the landlords to negotiate directly with the farm workers resulted in various under-the-table agreements that left the landlords still in control of their land even after quote-unquote selling it. Even so, the truly large landlords refused to sell their estates, and as it turned out, the official census data underreported the true extent of their controlled holdings. While CARP had mechanisms to force a sale, they were loath to use them since those landlords turned out to be also awfully powerful. Again, the landed elites turned to the same tactics, reducing the scope of the targeted land and delays. CARP was supposed to be done in 10 years, but a decade later had failed to achieve the full extent of its ambitions. Even the Aquino family's massive hacienda evaded the land reform targets, using a dubious stock distribution measure to do so. If the landlord president ducks the measure, then why should the other landlords fall in line? Implementation bogged down in bureaucracy. Over 20 state agencies were directly involved in the land process. Courts overwhelmed with disputes between landlords and tenants, 462,839 from 1988 to 2004. For the cases filed between 1988 and 1992, just 45% of the reported cases had been resolved. And by 1998, just 22.5% of the land distribution goal had been achieved. So in 1998, the Fidel Ramos government passed a 10-year extension to complete the implementation of land reform. Another 10 years later, in 2008, CARP had still yet to complete its measures, but progress had been made with some 80% accomplishment. 5.9 million hectares of land had been acquired and redistributed, benefiting 4 million households. With the job still not yet done, the succeeding Gloria Arroyo government yet again extended and refunded the program in 2008, seeing it as a political necessity. As of 2016, there remains hundreds of thousands of hectares to acquire and redistribute. CARP was not a complete failure, but as a way to reduce poverty and build up capital, it is hard to call such a 30-year odyssey a success. For that reason, economic development in the Philippines has taken a different direction from that of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. Those economies grew rich by transitioning out of agriculture, focusing on exports and building up capital in heavy industries. Land reform is at the core of that, allowing farmers to own the fruits of their labor, grow better foods, and build up their own wealth. Without land reform, you can still build an export sector, but most of your citizens will remain tenant farmers, producing just enough food to survive. Without land reform, the Philippines' big companies would not build up heavy industrial sites like what happened in Taiwan or South Korea, but rather they pivoted into services, banking, utilities, and real estate development, which are generally less productive and more dependent on local monopolies. Local monopolies. That leads into my last point. This means a lot more than just land ownership. These landed elites were powerful enough to block land reform. It is not hard to imagine the other ways in which they have bent the rules of that economy to their own advantage. But that would be for another video. The roots of land reform's failure in the Philippines extend back to hundreds of years of colonialism. It remains a charged political issue, one that people will protest over, but the will to make it happen also remains extremely weak. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel, sign up for the newsletter, and I'll see you guys next time.